Welcome, everybody. Thanks for the great turnout. Apparently people are pretty excited about ticks. Awesome. And there actually are a few seats up here if you haven't found them, and then Carol and Sam are being kind enough to put out a few more. So hopefully everybody will be able to find a place to sit. So Ruth Hallsworth, my most important comrade here, and along with Carol, reminded me to tell you folks, especially students, about the thing that just went by, but it'll come by again if I'm lucky, which is that the Sustainability and Water Conference, which will be later this month on the 26th, which is a Thursday in Augusta. If you want to have a poster or something, the abstract deadline is this, hang on a sec, wait for it. I think it's this Thursday or Wednesday. What's that? Thursday? Yeah. So just go for it, right? Not too late, but this is your shot. So don't wait till Friday is all I'm saying. Okay, so now just for a second, and lots of other cool things are going on, and great talks coming up, including next week. Abe Miller-Rushing will be here from Acadia National Park to talk about kind of the interface between science and management, kind of what do they need help with, including kind of things you might want to get involved in. So that should be fun.
Maybe you just press the...
Is there a better way to do it? Is that what you're telling me?
Well, that might be the bad button. Find out in 5 seconds.
Oh, you mean that might not have been the way to open it? Well, because I'm doing an introduction of you, so you can't come up yet. We'll just see how exciting
Just
this
keep
is.
me on my toes.
You made it exciting, and so right back at you.
There.
She arrived with 30 seconds to spare, so it's great. So it's my pleasure to welcome Carly Sponarski to the Mitchell Center. Not that she hasn't been here quite a few times in the past, but and in fact I can't quite remember the last time you talked here, but it could have been almost 3 years ago, when she was kind of newly arrived, and it took her a while to get here from Canada because she had to get an undergraduate degree at University of British Columbia in animal biology. And as I recall, one of the things that she was really into is growing up was like aquaria and marine life at aquaria, so just kind of neat. And then she did a master's at Calgary in environmental science and her PhD at Memorial University of Newfoundland in St. John's, Canada, in natural resource management within the geography department, where probably a lot of you don't realize that in some ways the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions would probably not be here were it not for the way in which a really prominent geographer, Bob Cates, who was a member of the National Academy of Sciences and one of the great geographers of the 20th century, kind of helped us get this whole sustainability thing off the ground and more or less helped found the field of sustainability science about 20 years ago, come to think of it. So, you'll quickly see, if you didn't already know, that Carly's work is at exactly this intersection that sustainability science is also interested in, which is kind of between human systems and natural systems. And she approaches this looking at particularly at the human dimensions and what they have to say about interactions between wildlife and communities, conflicts, decision-making. One thing you wouldn't necessarily know from today's talk is the breadth of her interests and those of her colleagues. There was a wonderful talk that I wasn't even here for in December by one of her PhD students, Melissa Fly, but it's available as I managed to get somebody to send it to me as an MP3. And Melissa worked on really important issues about the governance of Atlantic salmon, which is a really big deal because it's an endangered species. And I had the chance to think a lot about that and realized how important it was when there was a meeting on campus that only happens once every 2 years anywhere, which is called the Atlantic Salmon Ecosystems Forum. And the Department of Marine Resources, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and NOAA and the Penobscot Nation all said that Melissa's work as a master's student, working with Carly and with Joe Zaleski and Bridie McGreevy and others, was absolutely critical to them thinking about how to change the way they govern that process and kind of moving towards a more collaborative process. So this is, no matter how good this talk is, you want to hear that one as well, if I can plug it like that. Among other things, Carly is now involved with Ali Gardner, who's another faculty fellow in the Mitchell Center, in this really exciting project funded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture on ticks in basically forested systems in Maine. I think they got, like $1.17 million for that, so I'm sure that's a lot of what she's going to talk about. Please join me in welcoming Carly to the Mitchell Center. And if I screwed up your slides, we'll call Carol.
We'll find out in a few minutes. Okay, thank you everyone. Today I'm really speaking on behalf of a larger team. And I will introduce them momentarily. We are pretty much only 1 year into this larger project, so some of the results I have to share with you are very preliminary in the fact that they were put together in the last month for various presentations that we're now having to do. So not as much conclusions or future steps here to present today. But what I would like, I think this is the wrong one, I just have this feeling. But it's okay, we're going to use our imaginations today. But I'm going to kind of talk about the project and give it some introduction. I'm going to give you some background on tick and Lyme disease, and luckily I have Stephanie in the audience who can yell out when I'm wrong, because I really do study human beings and not small mammals or ticks, which I do know are an arachnid species. But anyways, talking about the project goals and components along with of these kind of various components of our project, more specifically the natural science, the social science, and what we're starting for the summer is the citizen science component of the project around some final thoughts, next steps, and those sorts of things. Okay, so our project here, we have various people located around campus. Dr. Ali Gardner from the School of Biology and Ecology, myself, and Dr. Leahy, Jessica Leahy from the School of Forest Research are the co-PIs on this project. And some of our cooperative members are Anne Lichtenwaller from Cooperative Extension, along with Laura Kennefic from U.S. Forest Service. We have some excellent students here. We have Stephanie, who I'll be introducing with the natural science component. We have Casey and Katie. Casey's a PhD student. Katie's a master's student working on the social science component. We have some past graduate students who just recently graduated. Christine Conte, who did her master's and finished this past fall. We have an undetermined postdoctorate student. If you have any good suggestions on who to hire, please let us know. For staff, we have Alyssa Ballman, who's also here in the audience. She's running the citizen science component of our project, and we have two specialists who have not yet hired, since we don't need them quite yet, but one is the outreach and the other one's the research specialist. So this is a large group of researchers. Yeah.
No way.
Yeah.
You want me to back out and you can...
I'm going to do that. I have that ability. I'm not completely useless with technology yet. See, you missed that pretty picture of a tick.
Yeah, sorry.
I mean, these are the things you come to see, right? Okay. So, as you can see, this map shows like the reported cases of Lyme disease in 2007, and if you can see here, the map that's going to come up is from 2018. This is a growing issue across the United States, particularly in the Northeast. Maine actually has the highest number of new Lyme disease prevalence in the state, in any state per capita in the United States. So it is actually a decent issue here in the here in Maine as well. Shockingly, because we also have lots of forest. The cycle of a life cycle of ticks is not necessarily complicated, but it might be longer than you might necessarily think. It starts off with eggs being laid in the spring. These eggs lay into and hatch into larvae. These larvae require a blood meal. That's their primary purpose in this life stage, where they latch primarily onto small mammals or small birds. Once they have their their blood meal, they will reside in leaf litter and in the environment throughout the fall and winter. Obviously, they then grow into nymphs, which also require their own blood meal. They can take this blood meal from a variety of different hosts. As you can see, they're depicted in the schematic. Once they have their blood meal, they'll molt into adults where they will need another additional blood meal, and particularly, as we call them, the deer tick, they need this on a deer to mate. So it's like food and sex mixed on one animal, which they then fall off, lay eggs, and the cycle happens. So this is about a 2-year life cycle that happens. The ticks, in terms of that time when they're off the host in the fall and the winter, they do require a certain amount of temperature and moisture in the leaf litter. More and more researchers finding that leaf litter plays a really important component into the survival of ticks throughout their life cycle when they're off host. In terms of being able to transmit diseases, but also just survival throughout the year, there's a certain amount of host diversity required, but also host competency is a really important component, particularly in the perpetuance of Lyme disease. So a competent host is an individual, much like a deer or a small mammal, that can harbor the bacteria that causes Lyme disease and also transmit it back to an uninfected tick. So what you find here is that, like for example, with the eggs, ticks are not born with Lyme disease. They have to get it from an infected host. So they typically will get that from either their if they get that from at the larva stage, they'll then overwinter, and at the nymph stage, that's really where they pose the most threat, because now they are infected and they can actually bite a diversity of different hosts, including us humans. And nymphs are incredibly tiny, so they often can bite people, and we don't necessarily know that we were bitten by a tick because they are so small. As I combed through my child's hair all summer trying to find them. And he's relatively small. But anyways, whereas at the adult stage, there is the chance of infection, but not as likely just because of the absolute number. More people are bitten by nymphs than they are adults. And so the infection prevalence is really between this nymphal and adult stages where we're finding that people are being infected. But in this fall-winter period, what we're trying to really understand is what kind of environmental factors really help to increase the chances of survival for the tick throughout their life cycle. And this is one component that we're really trying to understand because, good lead in here, Lyme disease cases in Maine are increasing. These cases tend to overfall with areas where there's high degrees of private landowners in the area. So if we have parcels of land that are being managed by private woodland owners instead of one large group, being able to work with and understand the various reasons why people manage their forests the way they do is really critical in ever trying to maybe potentially mitigate the abundance and the prevalence of Lyme disease in the tick population through actual forest harvest practice. Hopefully that makes sense. It did in my head. So our goals is really to identify timber harvesting practices that facilitate or inhibit tick-borne disease transmission. We want to characterize private forest landowners' decision-making processes related to forest management and tick-borne disease prevention. So what are people doing for themselves, but also on their land that may inhibit or facilitate tick-borne disease? We want to develop agent-based models of the effect of forest management practices on tick-borne disease transmission at the landscapes and spatial scales. Deliver tick-borne disease prevention education and citizen science programming to forest workers, as well as to develop interdisciplinary training opportunities in resilient agrosystems for graduate and undergraduate students. And for today's talk, what I'm going to really focus on actually is our goals 1, 2, and 4, because we only have 50 minutes. Okay, in terms of a larger schematic of how this project looks, we have 3 major components: research, extension, and education. Our research components got underway in terms of data collection this past summer. We have a social science component that's looking at forest management decisions. We also have a natural science component that's looking at the risk of tick-borne disease prevalence in the ecosystem. We have our extension component is kind of twofold. One, we are developing, and it will be implemented this summer, a citizen science project where we have volunteers collecting ticks on their private land, as well as a forest worker outreach and getting the word out in terms of what they can do to prevent tick-borne disease, and also just to build some relationships with forest workers. Our third component is this education component, where Allie, myself, and Jessica are integrating some of the components of our projects into our undergraduate and graduate level education courses that we teach here on campus, as well as, in addition, a 1-week workshop where we will have 5 to 8 students from around the country coming here to Maine to kind of dive into the various data sets that we are producing out of this work, and to do an intensive workshop around data analysis and also communication of data as well. Hopefully they will write a paper, which is really our goal as well. So I'm now, in the rest of my presentation, I'm really going to be going over those 3 components: the natural sciences, the social sciences, as well as the citizen science project. So to start off with the natural sciences, this work is being done by Stephanie Hurd. She's looking at the effects of timber harvesting on Zydes scapularis densities and tick-borne pathogen transmission in Maine. I'm now going to refer to Zydes scapularis as the deer tick, because I have a large fear that I'm going to mispronounce it at one point in my talk. Homo sapien, way easier to say as a species name for the animal that I study. But anyways, so her project goal is to identify timber harvesting practices that facilitate or inhibit tick transmission and tick-borne pathogens. More specifically, she's looking at determining how timber harvesting affects tick density, and to determine how timber harvesting affects host availability, to determine how timber harvesting affects microhabit features, as well as determine how timber harvesting affects infection prevalence amongst the tick population. Right. So some of her work has been based off of, in terms of our decision making around what data we do collect and the sites that we pick in terms of the harvest frequency, around this pilot study that Christine Conte, who is a master's student in Allie Gardner's group until she graduated in December of 2019. What Christine found on her site, she did did data collection on fewer sites than Stephanie has been doing work on, but she broke it up into 2: harvest, so harvest in the last 5 years, and sites that had no harvest, and so that meant no cutting of any kind of tree within the last 25 years. And what she found in this study was that there were far less deer ticks in harvested areas within the last 5 years. And that could be because of this microclimate that the ticks require in their fall winter kind of hibernation period, or when they're off host period. And so this kind of framing really helped Stephanie to kind of hone what she wanted to do in terms of her site selection. And so for experimental design, there's a total of 15 experimental units. There's 5 different locations in southern Maine, and these 5 different locations each have 3 treatments within them. So I'll talk about the treatments in a second. Or the treatments are a control, so no harvesting within the last 20 years. We have a treatment level of low, so that was harvested within the last 5 years, and a treatment level of high, which was between 5 and 15 years, roughly. And so what she did within a treatment, she laid out these grids, 70 by 70 meter square grids, and in these grids she took a variety of different measurements, which included forest density, species identification, along with using the size of the prisms were used to note age of the density, along with sapling cuttings identified down to age. There was also tick dragging, obviously. We didn't forget that one, don't worry. Tick dragging was done along the transects of each of the grid lines. If you need to if you really, really want to try to keep ticks off of you when you're in the forest, talk to Stephanie. They came up with a very interesting layering, duct taping of clothes to minimize ticks, and they still got them on them. So maybe preventative behaviors might not necessarily always work, but they were also just trying to seek out ticks. So maybe the ticks knew that they wanted them to come near them. They also, in these grids, did small mammal trapping along with camera traps as well. Okay, so variety of different pieces of data taken for each of these grid sections. I'd like to say, though, that there were, these are some preliminary results, that Steph and her crew collected 1,258 ticks this past summer. They have additional data collection to do this summer coming up. They also dragged a total of 5,250 meters over the summer in those very, very, very hot outfits. What we found here was that the most prevalent tick species in these treatment areas were the deer tick. And there are more ticks were found in the low and high, but the numbers aren't necessarily very far apart, and we're only doing our first data collection season, so we still have additional data collection to do in order to find out if there was actually treatment effect. The second being the dog tick. Did I remember that correctly? Thank you. In terms of prevalence across the landscape. Okay, diving a bit more into the deer tick, what we found was that in all 3 treatment sites, the nymph was the most prevalent versus the adults, where they were substantially less in our treatment sites. Okay, Steph has had the chance to review or to collect data on the small mammal trapping that was happened and put that into a nice table for us today. Across the state, for other people who do small mammal research, what we found was it was just a very low season, so there wasn't very many small mammals out there to get to catch. So these results kind of reflect a yearly cyclical cycle that is happening currently, and we'll be continuing the small mammal trapping this coming summer. Okay. Steph is working on her next step, which also involves inputting data on the camera traps. She's found a variety of different species: bobcat, coyote, deer, porcupine. She had a very aggressive porcupine knock down her camera a number of times. It was a good sequence of videos. Apparently the porcupine did not like the placement of that camera. Did not like Big Brother, basically, watching its every move. So she's inputting that data right now, along with prepping, as it is already March, terrifyingly enough, for the summer field season, where she's going to be duplicating the data collection that she did this past summer. Okay, so moving in now into the social science components of this project, we actually have 2 projects that I'm going to be talking about. First of is Katie Perry's project. She's a master's student of mine, and Jessica Leahy's. Her project is Acting Out of Lyme, Characterizing the Human Dimensions of Lyme Disease Prevention and Management here in Maine. Her study area overlaps with Steph's study area, so that we have information from landowners and recreationalists in this area. Jessica Leahy could not be here today, so I took a picture off her Facebook page and put it in my presentation. So she's here in spirit supporting me. But there are 2 components that I'm going to be talking about today. First is a recreationist or hiker survey that Katie did, and then pairing that with similar variables but adding to is a survey she did with small or private woodland owners in the same general area. So her purpose of her study is to understand the social and cognitive factors that influence individuals' decisions to engage in Lyme disease prevention behaviors and management strategies on their land. More specifically, the objectives of this project is to develop an effective health behavior model to be used in the context of Lyme disease prevention, as well as to characterize the ways in which private woodland owners incorporate Lyme disease prevention into their woodland management decisions currently, and how willing they would be to adapt their management behavior to reduce the risk of Lyme disease exposure in the future. So first we're going to talk about the recreationalists. Katie has developed this model based on merging 2 different health models together to try to contextualize it to the current situation, where she looks at things like response and self-efficacy influencing an overall sense of efficacy towards their ability to actually do the behaviors, their want to do the behaviors, modifying variables like their demographics, their experience, and their knowledge. And what we're going to find out is actually people are generally quite knowledgeable about Lyme disease, in southern Maine at least, have perceived risks. And this is a combination of the severity, so the perceived, how bad do you think it is if you actually contracted the disease, but also your susceptibility. So how at risk are you of actually getting it if you're out in the woods? Outcome expectations that are around perceived barriers, but also perceived benefits of doing these types of behaviors, and these normative beliefs. And these are both injunctive and descriptive in the sense of they're coming from within, and also external pressures of doing these behaviors. How much do you care that you look like a nerd with your socks tucked over your jeans? Let's be honest, right? And so all of these kind of thought processes go into basically an output of a behavior of whether someone would or would not participate in these types of behaviors. And so what Katie did over the summer was she did an on-site intercept survey at Bradbury Mountain State Park in Pownell, Maine, where she interviewed 401 participants at the entrance of this trail system. And she's currently doing that data analysis and data cleaning at this state, so we don't necessarily have any preliminary results for this project. But the second side, which we do have some preliminary results, in addition to these kind of self-reported behaviors and tendencies, we added on questions with, we wanted to ask private woodland owners about kind of their land management objectives. Was it conservation? Is it an investment? Is it for production of a agricultural good? Their land management history. How much do they know of what has happened on their land? Or also just their past tree removal in the last few years, for example. Their property engagement, like what is the purpose of them owning this property, or what kind of, why do they have it, their management purposes. Their attitudes and perceptions of management strategies. So what are they doing? How much planning and forethought are they putting into their land, as well as their motivations behind their management decisions, whether it's economic or for health factors, for example. So what kind of thoughts go into what they are doing on their land and why they're doing it? Okay. So Katie has collected data using two different methods. This is kind of like a side project that we're working on. As we all know, potentially that mail-out surveys in particular are getting harder and harder to get people to respond to, unless you're like me, who just thinks it's bad karma. Send me a survey, I'll fill it out, because I want people to fill out mine. But we used two different methods to kind of compare what our type of response rate was, what we would get. And so we used a drop-off pickup method, that's actually administered in person. Katie and her research assistant Erin went to people's houses who owned at least 10 acres of land. We got this information through town tax data sheets. And so you go to someone's house, you drop off a survey with some instructions to fill it out in the next 2 days, because you'll be back to pick it up. 2 days later, Katie and Erin would come back. If the survey was completed, they would retrieve it, leave a thank you note. If it was incomplete, the person received a reminder postcard saying, "I'll be back in 2 more days." And then 2 more days, Katie and Erin would return to the house. They would, if a packet was obviously there, collect it, yay, thank you. If not, leave an additional survey packet with a return postmarked envelope for instructing people to mail it back to us. And what we found with that is that we actually got a 69% response rate with this method. It did take time, obviously, but what was also nice about this is that Katie got a lot of face-to-face conversations. Always work in pairs. Safety first, everyone. No, everyone was really great who we spoke to, but it was great because people saw a face to the researcher. There was a personal story behind it, but also Katie got to have some very interesting conversations with people about their land management and their concern around ticks. So I think that also contextualized a lot of the responses that she was getting, would be getting in her survey. The second form of data collection that we did was mail-out surveys. We did 3 mailings here, kind of that typical mail out a survey packet 2 weeks later, a reminder postcard 2 weeks later, an additional packet with return postmarked envelopes. And with this method, we found that we got a 33% response rate, which is a little bit higher than the average, but still not amazing. So what we're actually going to be doing is continuing on with these two forms of data collection this spring to ramp up our sample size to about 400 total with landowners as well. So we kind of did this as a bit of a pilot study to see how the methods would work. And that's the survey. Just kind of a quick comparison for those who do survey work in the room and are interested. We found that people who responded to either were basically similar, except for we found that more women responded to the drop-off pickup, or we like to call it DOPU, in our lab. More women tended to respond to that method, and we also found that the average education level was actually a little bit lower, but not by much. But generally, most of the demographics were similar between the two databases, which is really interesting and good. Some preliminary results. We found that generally the people that we surveyed, and these are the woodland owners, they know about Lyme disease, how to, if you do get a tick bite, what are those kind of signs like the bullseye to look for example. But what was really interesting that I want to take note is bolded is the fact that people weren't necessarily as aware that Maine has the highest rate of new Lyme disease cases per capita in the country. And so there's that kind of misstep between that susceptibility and the vulnerability that people aren't necessarily very aware of in Maine. Other preliminary results that are interesting is the fact that people mostly agree that there is a high risk that they will be bitten by a tick if they spend time in their woodlot. So that there is prevalence. So again, that disconnect between, yes, there's a high chance of me being bitten, but not necessarily get Lyme disease. But luckily, they do realize that the more time they spend out, the chances of them being bitten are probably higher. And so that second item, where if there are ticks on my property, I'm likely to get Lyme disease, people didn't necessarily agree with that. But they do think that there are higher chances of being bitten, which is that third item. Their chances of being bitten are actually more than the average Mainer, since they do spend so much time in their woodlot. Okay. But the last item, I feel worried about ticks after being in my woodland. Strongly agree, people aren't necessarily that worried about ticks either. So again, that disconnect between ticks and tick-borne disease is present. In behaviors, what we find is that people aren't avoiding their property. They own it, there's a reason for it, and it's not just to, just look pretty. People are wanting to interact with it, and so they're not necessarily avoiding their woodlots because of the presence of tick-borne diseases. As well as what we're finding here is that people are not necessarily doing the preventative measures like protective clothing and repellents, but what we're finding is more people are relying on the tick checks, which is great, don't stop doing that, but when the ticks are incredibly small, your eyesight might not catch them, but also they're parts of your body that you cannot see unless you have a very close friend that might want to check those parts for you. So there is kind of like a spectrum of what people are doing and not doing in terms of their own behaviors around tick prevention. Okay. So next steps for Katie, data collection, finalizing concepts of her framework around the woodland owners and data analysis. The second study is the second social science study. I know there's 2 out of 3 technically in this project. I'm feeling like, whew, this is good. Usually it's a 1-to-2 ratio. But anyways, Casey is looking at the social dimensions of tick and Lyme disease problem in Maine. His project is looking at the assessment of social dimensions of risk towards Lyme disease in Maine and how this relates to community level management. So where Katie was really focusing on individual behavior, Casey's more looking at the community at the landscape level. His current objectives are to analyze communication outreach on tick and Lyme disease from government and journalism sources in Maine, to explore the acceptance of tick management options related to perceptions of vulnerability and communication sources, as well as what I think is a really interesting component of his project is to create a GIS indicator map of community social vulnerability around Lyme disease based on secondary data, as well as to integrate rural public school teachers in identifying perceptions of vulnerability and management needs in rural communities. So to kind of go through some of his work, as each of these kind of components are ongoing and current pieces of work. He's looking at outreach material from a variety of sources, news media, along with government, like Maine CDC, for example, and looking at how these organizations are framing messages. How much uncertainty is being spoken about in the messages, fear, how much of it is based on information, and really using this to identify strengths and weaknesses in the messaging around ticks and more prevalently tick-borne diseases in the state, as well as like what commonalities there lie. Because it's really important with outreach material around a safety issue that the messaging across all organizations is the same. And that helps people minimize social fatigue around how do they then just to figure out what is wrong and correct. But also it shows that there is certainty in information when the messaging is consistent. His second objective around the perceived vulnerability is using data that Katie collected with the woodlot owners this past summer around perceived vulnerability. So these are concepts that include susceptibility and also fear and aversion to getting Lyme disease. Sources of credibility, which institutions do people trust concerning information, and how this then influences, both of these items influence the acceptance of tick management responses. And of course, your acceptance might be for a variety of different reasons. So the acceptance of tick management responses are kind of an amalgamation of the effectiveness of that practice, the practicality, the environmental safety, the safe for humans, the social acceptability, and the political attractiveness of it. And so we're still collecting this data, as I showed in Katie's portion of the project, but what we do have here is some preliminary data to show you today. And so some of the possible management options that we were looking into to potentially mitigate tick-borne disease prevalence on the landscape are these 5 indicators, like removing deer or small mammals, increasing a predator like red fox, spraying herbicides, or changing forestry practices. And for each of these different types of management options, we got people to agree or strongly disagree to those kind of components that we think summatively make up someone's acceptance of a management option. So that would be the effectiveness, the environmental safetyness of it, the safe for human health, practical, the social acceptance, and so on. And so what we found here with each of these management practices here, what we did was we did a composite rating. So we basically amalgamated all of those 6 kind of components of acceptability into one. And what we found was actually the forestry practices were the most acceptable and changing across all of those different components. Now, these are very preliminary data done only on a handful of surveys, but shows some hopefully positive results, moving that forestry practices are something that people are open to and accepting of them changing in order to mitigate disease spread in the state. Diving into this one component, though, changing forestry practice on my woodlot would reduce Lyme disease. What we find here is that people actually really care about human health and safety, and that's really at the forefront of their willingness to accept management strategies, which is, I think, well, not necessarily shocking, but something that I think with the spread of, if we're trying to mitigate the spread of disease that can affect human health, this really does help us kind of hone and make those messages more powerful. Okay. Another component is that cool part that is the GIS social vulnerability scale. So examining kind of secondary data around the socioeconomic status of a town, the population density, the occupation, the health care access, the land development, and occupation. For example, if a town is mostly the employment is higher of like woodland owners or people who are involved in the forestry, they have members of their community that probably have more of a chance of becoming infected by Lyme disease or at least interacting with ticks. And so much like the maps I showed you in the beginning of the presentation, which shows prevalence across the state, at a community level, Casey is going to try to map out social vulnerability and which towns are more vulnerable to tick-borne diseases. And his fourth component of his project is really looking at rural nurses as a mediator between the information provided at the state level down to the community members, using the students and parents as that interface. And so he's going to be interviewing rural nurses to kind of identify adaptation efforts, community outreach effectiveness, like what would be best to communicate with residents, areas of vulnerability among students and schools, also around areas of need for establishing resilience in these communities. So the ability of these communities to actually adapt to high cases of Lyme disease, for example. Now, moving on to that extension component of our project, I'm now going to show, in the final slides of our project, I'm going to showcase the citizen science, which I think is really a really cool part of our project, and you'll see why. One, I love the logo. We're going to have t-shirts. We'll sell them, no problem. So Alyssa Ballman is here in the audience, and she's heading up the Maine Forest Tick Survey, and this is a citizen science project that we're developing and we'll be implementing this summer. And so the goal of the citizen science component is to really understand the relationship. So our goal of our project, if we remember, is the relationship between land management and tick-borne risks, where the goal of the citizen science project is really to quantify risk on woodland owner properties, as well as to educate landowners. And so citizen science is a great way of having that one-on-one interaction with people to, one, understand their risks and their perceptions of the problem, but also to provide information for them directly. And so this is the cool part of the project. Typically, when it comes to collecting information about the prevalence of ticks, but also tick-borne disease on landscape, the CDC, for example, relies on citizens to passively check themselves, which we know from our data that people do tick checks on themselves or on their animal, and then submit them for testing. And this is what we call passive surveillance. What our project wants to do is more active surveillance. So we're actually going to get people to dress up. Well, it might not go to the extent that Stephanie and her crew did, but maybe that's a good citizen science challenge. But actively survey their property for ticks, collecting them on these drag cloths, and then submitting them to us for data collection or for data analysis. And so what we're looking for in these communities along the coast is people who own 10 to 1,000 acres of land. We're looking for about 250 citizen scientists over about a 2-summer period who are going to actively do surveillance on their property. I'm going to get into what does active surveillance look like in a moment here. We're currently, though, in the stage of recruitment. So we have our website up, we've got Facebook up. We're also leaning on our advisory board that has a lot of members from around the state, but particularly in those counties that we are identifying as high tick prevalent areas that will also disseminate this project out to other people and hopefully garner some interest. So look us up on Facebook. Forest Tick Survey, as well as brochures, hopefully garnering those volunteers to participate. And so here we're at the terrifying already at the March point. So we're actively recruiting through press release on our website and Facebook, as I said. Come June, we're going to be starting these trainings, and locations of these trainings are to be determined. It really depends on the location of our volunteers, but we will be going out to them to help train them. In this training, they'll get a tick collecting kit that includes a drag net and being trained on how to do it and how to identify or how to look, because you do definitely need to be able to see very, very small nymphs, for example. We'll be asking our citizen science to do their tick collection in July and then submitting them to us for processing throughout the fall. And so, as I said, this training is going to happen in June. They're going to get this nifty tick collecting kit, as well as hands-on training, just so that we know that everyone is doing, and we're going to be getting them to do 70-meter transects on their land. The tick collection will happen 3 times over the course of July. We're asking people not to do the drag, only to do the drag 2 days after sunny weather. If it's rained in that time, the ticks go into hiding. Apparently they're like sugar, they melt, but they go into hiding, so we do need some environmental conditions before they're allowed to drag. These Drives will be as timed as we can across all of them, all of the different citizen scientists in terms of one drag per week in July, as well as when they sign up for the project, they will be doing an intake survey, which allows us to gain information around their land management practices. Okay. In the fall, this is when it becomes our job again, where we identify the ticks that are collected over July by our citizen scientists. We test them for various pathogens, including Lyme, and we also then will send personalized results to the participants so that they are aware of what is and isn't on their land when they collect it in July. Okay. So some final thoughts about this project. We're about 1 year in at this point. Scary how time flies. This is a three-year project. I don't normally share results when I'm trying to do my final thoughts, but I thought that this was kind of an interesting piece around people's concerns. And so we asked people, how concerned are you about climate change and its effect on Lyme disease? And we actually found that the majority of people were concerned to very concerned about the link between climate change and Lyme disease. But when we then took it down to land use change and its effect on Lyme disease, that concern was more dispersed among the different response categories. People were generally concerned from moderate to very, but there wasn't necessarily that majority between the concerned and very concerned that we see in that climate change, which is interesting considering the discussion of the actual occurrence of climate change on at the national level, that people here were generally concerned about climate change, which I think is really interesting, and that also shows the need to link climate change to how land use will have to change with that changing environment. We obviously have more data to collect, and we are actively doing that this coming year. What is promising, though, in our preliminary results is that forest management practices is a supportive management option in mitigating ticks and tick-borne disease in the state, which is, I think, really a positive fact. That people want to protect their families, and it's a very strong motivator in their willingness to change their forest management practices. And despite the links of Lyme disease spread with both climate change and land use change, private woodland owners had much less concern about their land use change than in climate change, which is an interesting disconnect that we need to look into further. But all of this is going to be helpful in terms of our outreach efforts that will be starting in the near future. And so where are we at? Well, I think this is a very dynamic project just because we're kind of tackling this really complicated socio-ecological issue from a variety of different ways. One, we're training students here on campus, both undergraduate and graduate students. We have our intensive workshop, which will be kind of being able to take our information and train students outside of the campus as well. We have a large component around tick-borne disease outreach, not only in the citizen science, but in our extension person as well that we'll be hiring shortly. Examining what kind of forest management practices are actually even just happening with private woodland owners in the state of Maine, and how adaptable will that really be in the future when it comes to maybe collaborative management across larger swaths of land and not just on individual parcels. As well as this idea around citizen science, where we're really kind of activating this active surveillance of ticks, which helps us to kind of magnify the amount of data and information we can collect on the tick abundance in the state, which I think is really interesting. And so our next steps, we're actually currently hiring an outreach specialist, and this person will be charged with going around to major state events where there's the potential of interacting with people who own wood lots, but also with the general public as well. In the next year, we'll also be hiring a postdoctorate researcher who will be having the fun task of amalgamating all of the data and information we've collected over the social and the natural science components into hopefully an agent-based model, and kind of bringing that kind of summative pieces of research together, which I think is really is going to be very interesting. And with that, I would really like to thank our funders and our wonderful research team. And with that, I'd like to open up to any questions.
I was curious on On the distribution map that you had early on from 2008, I think, to 2018,
Mm-hmm.
Western Mass was sort of like lit up as a place where all of a sudden there wasn't a Lyme density change. It went in the reverse. And being from that area, I was sort of curious why there was that change.
Steph, do you?
It's a CDC map, so there might be something with their website. Also, I think with Massachusetts, they have their own reporting with passive surveillance, with citizens sending things into their own agencies there. So there might be a bit of a disconnect with the reporting from the state versus what was given to the CDC overall.
Mhm.
I can't give you a definite answer though, but I also noticed that map.
Mhm. Yeah. Mac?
This is going to be probably outside your wheelhouse, but you can pass it off to you. I'm confused by the relationship between changing forest practices and ticks. The metric you were studying
Mm-hmm.
was time elapsed since the last timber harvest.
Yes.
More than 20 years, and less than 5 or something
Mhm.
like that. But there's always going to be an elapsed time after the last harvest, and it's up on really large wood lots. It's almost always going to be 15, 20 plus years. So what would you ask a landowner to do to change their forest practices that would influence ticks?
Steph, do you want to take the first half of that question?
So there's a time scale we're looking at, but we're also assessing the intensity of foresting, of forest like harvest. So with Christine Conti, she looked at harvest versus no harvest, and hers was in the past 5 years. With mine, I'm looking at a longer time scale to see, okay, after that cutting occurred, with a lot more cutting with a high intensity versus not a lot was harvested, and then versus my control no harvesting. Kind of what that means now after more time has passed. And so for recommendations to landowners, it might be something along the lines of, do you want to limit how much harvesting you're doing, like while still harvesting? Will that decrease your risk or increase it? And additionally, it's giving them a sense on that time scale of when their risk is greatest. So it might be hopefully to give recommendations to how to change how they manage it, but it's also a way of letting you know, depending on how you manage, that will affect your risk overall. Does that answer?
Yeah, I understand better now, but it just strikes me so complicated in terms of effects of the forest management on the mammal populations,
Yeah.
on the behavior of the people, and there's a zillion ways you can do forest management.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, and that's hopefully what we're trying to elucidate kind of the underlying mechanisms of it all to see if there's this ecological cascade that affects the large mammals, the small mammals, and the microhabitat features. To see something if there's a certain type of harvesting that landowners may do that affects the microhabitat, and if there's a way to intervene in that in some way, or if there's a way to intervene on the effect it has on small mammals and host for Lyme disease. Yeah, it is. It's very complicated. So that is what we're trying to do, is kind of figure out those underlying mechanisms there.
Mm-hmm.
We can talk about it some other time.
Sure, that's perfect.
So, go ahead. One of your questions, I inferred from it that you're saying ticks are mostly in the woods, not other places. Is that correct?
Yes, the true false question was asking if people, it was really looking at if people knew where ticks could be found.
And is it true that ticks are only found in the woods?
And within a fringed area, yes. So it's, like if you have a large grass area, they're probably not going to be in the middle, but if they're getting closer to a woodland area, then they could be coming out. But yeah, they're looking for, ticks are, as this one is questing right now, they're looking to passively, they need enough vegetation to get up high enough to potentially passively brush on to an animal or human being as they're walking by. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it just doesn't correspond to my experience.
Oh.
They're also very sensitive to desiccation, drying out, so they usually try to remain in an area that is a bit more shaded, like the woods. And so if you have a big grassy area, that would probably not be ideal for them,
Mhm.
just in terms of survival.
Yeah, the questing habitat is really the more taller, like, or waist-high vegetation, so tall grass might work, but if it's really exposed to sunlight, they would desiccate pretty easily.
Yeah.
And like a very short-cut lawn is not great nesting habitat for them.
I was wondering, since Maine is shown as being like an increased area of risk for this, if you guys have also noticed increased resources for people who have contracted Lyme disease, like, do you have any sense of if that side of the kind of equation has been increasing as well?
No, we don't have, like, Casey will potentially kind of get into that with some of his work, but at this point, no, we haven't really tracked the resources going into Lyme disease treatment. Yeah.
So I wondered, can't quite remember, but Ali and Sandra
Mhm.
spoke about some of the work they're doing that at least in part is focused on ticks and kind of visitor behavior at Acadia National Park. Is it, and I guess they're a little farther along than you guys in terms of their start date. I'm not actually sure about that, or at least they were, had some results too that I feel like I've heard bits of.
Mhm.
Is there things that they're looking at that either help you or vice versa, or going about things in different ways that are kind of giving you a bigger picture of this?
Well, I think Allie has a better idea of what's happening in terms of, her overall picture of what's happening with ticks and tick-borne disease across the Maine landscape is really kind of like her wheelhouse. But in terms of like Sandra's component, they're really looking at the efficacy of like what are visitors to Acadia National Park doing to prevent bites. So in that way, it very much mirrors what Katie has been doing with the hikers as well. But Acadia National Park is a different system because it's not necessarily logged. It's not necessarily logged for goods. So there's overlap in that ability in our information of understanding like a tick abundance and prevalence of Lyme disease on the landscape. And but I don't even, is Ali doing small mammal trapping at all on Acadia? I think she's just doing tick drags.
I think she's just doing tick drag.
Yeah.
There was something earlier on, but
Sarah did something.
I think she like maybe earlier on, but mostly she's looking at like gear stat surveys
Mhm.
as well, and then like mostly tick dragging.
Yeah, so in a way, like another form of like past, like they're looking at environmental indicators to see abundance of certain animals or presence of certain animals, I should say, sorry. Whereas with Steph's work, we're actually actively collecting at least small mammals, which are like kind of a critical component in the tick life cycle. So along with other environmental factors. So they're related but different.
So from the human dimension standpoint, would you expect, do you have a hypothesis about how humans perceive the risk or respond to it would vary among Acadia? Is that something that you guys think about, or it's just like separate stuff and hard to compare?
Well, it actually comes down, I think, to what we find in the literature, but also I think preliminary between the two studies is really around people's experience with. So basically, as you know, tick abundance is high, or the chances of you being bitten goes up, and you just become kind of like, that's okay. That's just what it happens in my environment. You actually don't participate in those preventative behaviors as much because it's just you just get used to it. Whereas for visitors in Acadia, particularly who are new to the area and know that ticks are around but don't necessarily have that experience with them, they actually kind of, in a way, they do exactly what they're supposed to do, at least, and they try to do those preventative behaviors. So Ali and Jessica and I have talked about this as like Maine's kind of at that tipping point where ticks are relatively still novel, that there might be the capacity to kind of harness that novel energy and move it into shifting behaviors that are more proactive. Whereas if it becomes just like, this is what's here, people aren't necessarily have that activation energy to make change. Or it's harder to do, I should say.
So I guess we're at time. If you have more questions, come on up, but let's thank Carly for a great presentation.